Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for joining us at the CLG Europe event on accelerating industrial decarbonisation and driving demand for climate-neutral materials and products. We're very pleased to have you here today, and we're very pleased for those of you who are able to join us on the live stream for what I think should be a really interesting and productive discussion. We are we're hoping to have one additional speaker join us, so apologies if that's slightly disruptive as they do join us, but it should be, I think they'll be with us fairly shortly. This is a key topic, as I'm sure everybody who is in the audience and who is on the screen understands. As we work towards this journey towards net zero, this journey towards a climate neutral economy, the importance of decarbonising industrial sectors and working to shift those sectors is something that has got more and more attention and more energy and dynamism behind it as we've identified the potential and the routes to move that forward on. It's one of the areas where I think we've got a huge amount of learning and understanding about the innovative potential about what industry is able to deliver. But one of the things that we've wanted to highlight through CLG Europe is that we think there is an under-addressed lever to be pulled, which is about creating demand for climate neutral goods and services. And this is something that business can work on, but it's also something that government needs to create the policy landscape that is able to support that. So that's a key thing for us. We released a report around this called Tomorrow's Markets Today that we co-developed with the Agora Energiewende, the German think tank, and that has set out some specific recommendations for how that could take place, particularly looking at the need for transparency, the need for data to be able to flow, and the need for using the breadth of policy tools to support that market creation to create lead markets. So we're going to have a great agenda. We're going to start with some, shall we say, contextual pieces from, we have Diederik Samsom from the European Commission, Head of Cabinet for Executive Vice President Timmermans from the European Commission. We also have Faustine de la Salle, who is co-director of the Mission Possible Partnership. And we hopefully will be joined by Jakob Dalunde. So do come and join us on stage if that's okay, Jakob. Great so that you've been able to get here. Who from the European Parliament, so we'll have a perspective from the European Parliament as well. So we're going to hear these kind of settings, and then I'm going to invite some of CLG Europe's members and some of the businesses involved in our work to come and talk about how we're planning to take things forward, and particularly to talk about a new task force that we're launching on this, which will be aiming to accelerate this process and really kind of add some weight, some clarity to this topic. So without too much further ado, I want to hand over to my speakers. So I'm very pleased that we're able to be joined by Diederik Samsom, who I imagine is, like many of us, a very busy person at this point, but having an active and hopefully productive COP. Diederik, over to you.
Thank you. Shall I go for that?
It's whatever.
This one.
Yeah, that's
much better. So I want to be brief, and thank you for having me on this stage talking about this important subject. So it's interesting that you now focus on sort of one angle of the sustainability train towards the future, which is creating demand. Because if you look at the dynamics of making progress, it's actually like a tango. But a tango of three, which is, as everybody of you knows, a tango is already very difficult with two. So it's hardly possible, almost impossible with three. And the three are obviously business, community, government, and public, society. And they are in a dance together. And if one of them makes the wrong move at the wrong time, we all fall flat on the ground. And I want to, if you look back at the last 10 years, we are sort of leaving a decade of incredible innovation, where especially the business community made some very significant and timely steps forward. And the rest of us, government and society, were able to follow. Let's look at, for instance, renewable energy, offshore wind, for instance. That is a mind-boggling story of cost reduction, innovation, and scale-up. Only 10 years ago, offshore wind was unaffordable in any way. So we had to go to taxpayers and saying, okay, we want to develop this offshore wind hobby of us. Can you pay up about 20 cents per kilowatt hour, which is a mind-boggling amount of money. And far from being profitable. Same story for solar, obviously. Same story, maybe even more incredible for electrical vehicles. If you look back at the first electrical vehicle entering the consumer market about 12 years ago or 13 years ago, that was, well, first of all, it had a range to the end of the street, and then you were waving your plug and looking for a socket. It was ugly, and it was way too small. It was nowhere near a consumer product, actually. And now, 10 years later, we are entering a new era in which, by innovation, by scale-up, we made incredible progress. But now, obviously, the other two actors in the game have to join the dance and maybe take over a little and guide the three of us into the right direction. So that's where legislation comes in, and that's where consumers come in. And hopefully, again, in a tango where we inspire each other to make better moves. And the legislation, obviously close to my heart, the one that we designed as a European Commission, that Frans Timmermans as the EVP designed, as the commissioner responsible for the Green Deal, is the Fit for 55 legislation, in which we try and almost literally seize that opportunity that innovation brought us and is still bringing us, by the way, and should still bring us in the future, and start and try to accelerate that, to increase that and improve that. That obviously starts with the emission trading system, where industry was obliged so far to reduce its emissions compared to 1990 with about, well, 45%, 48%. Now it's going to be 63. So the ramp down of your CO2 emissions is almost a black ski piste. It's incredibly fast. And it implies that you cannot get there as industry by making incremental steps, by just increasing your efficiency one notch, and then trying to blend a little more renewables into your energy supply one notch. No, it's about a real transition, about a real transformation of your industry. Look at steel. The way we make steel, the way we make base chemicals, that has to change drastically. You have to change your machines. So that's one part of it. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, we can't leave it at just one instrument driving that tango forward. It's more complicated than that. The dance is a complicated one. So we need more instruments, like regulation, like subsidies, like actually the whole kitchen sink, the whole toolbox of instruments. I know that there's economists out there that argue that if you have one goal, decarbonisation, you should have one instrument. So if you have more than one instrument for one goal, you're inefficient. That's what Nobel Prize winning economists teach us. The funny part about that theory is that it implies that we are all perfect spheres operating in a vacuum, taking all rational decisions. Well, we're not perfect spheres, we do not operate in a vacuum, and we do not take rational decisions, I can assure you. So you need much more than one instrument to get this dance going. And that's where the Fit for 55 becomes complicated, but also where it becomes promising, where it has different opportunities for different parts of society, for different parts of industry, to seize the opportunity that we now offer. So while in the last decade, the industry offered opportunities that we are now seizing as a society and as legislators, I predict that in the next 5 to 10 years, the dynamic will be turned around a little, and legislators will push forward on industry to go even faster. And then, and that's the difficult part of it, we'll try, because in a democracy it's always a very delicate dance, try and push consumers, who happen to be voters too, push them forward into the right direction, creating markets for those climate neutral products. And that's where we haven't mastered the trick yet. I can talk about the ETS as if it was a machine. That functions pretty well. I cannot talk about the market as if it's a one-dimensional thing that I know how to steer forward and that I know how those consumers will behave. We don't know. And that's where this dance gets really into a trial and error. And what we have to do, if we cannot design the best possible policy ex ante, we have to commit ourselves to sticking together. Industry, legislators, and consumer organizations have to stick together in the next 5 to 10 years in order to make this work. Because I can predict to you that we will hit a few snags, roadblocks, so to speak. If you talk about, and I already mentioned that example, if you talk about steel, and you talk about real clean steel, decarbonized steel, climate neutral steel, you talk about a different galaxy in terms of the technology that is needed, the raw materials that are needed for that, hydrogen, for instance, and the costs that are involved in making that happen. And again, here, it's an amazing story, because only 5 years ago, if you would go to the steel industry and talk about steel made out of hydrogen, they would roll their eyes, laugh you out of the room, or even hand you the basic book of chemistry, telling you that it can't be done. And now we have the first carbon neutral steel being made at costs that are way too expensive to be competitive, but that's where we come in. So that's what I mean. If industry puts another step forward in response to what we put on the table in legislation and tries to make that, in this case, as an example, climate neutral steel a reality, we can respond to that by designing our subsidy instruments, contracts for difference, paid for out of the innovation fund that is filled with the money that comes from the ETS, the emission trading system. So, well, it looks like a nice machinery that makes the rounds. But we don't know whether that will function correctly. Well, I can predict that it won't in the beginning. So that's where I plead to all of you, business community, also consumer organizations, to commit to stick together. Because we will make mistakes in the next 5 to 10 years, a lot of them, and we will have to repair all of them while doing the dance, while making that tango, again, with the three of us. And this is only one example. I can talk about every sector, every technology, every part, but it's a similar story. It's about the innovation that brought us here now. It's about the urgency that requires legislators to not settle for this, where we are right now, but really push forward, making mistakes doing that. And it's about consumers that happen to be voters too, that have to go along and sometimes even ask for more. That would be the best possible dynamic. We don't see that a lot, but sometimes you do see elections being about climate change. Elections where parties that are progressive and have far-reaching proposals actually do not lose votes. And that's obviously the best possible dynamic that we can have. But we can't count on that being a stable factor in our work towards the future. So, summarizing, you did an amazing job with the innovation, creating the circumstances that we, from the Green Deal, can now seize and push further into the future. But the road ahead is much more complicated than the road that we just have behind us. So stick together, be committed to make this work. We are. We are also committed to make up on our mistakes if we make them, and we will. If you do the same, we will get there together. Thank you.
Thank you, Diederik. That's a great opening set of remarks, in which I feel like if I summarize it, you're saying we're part of a three-partner tango, and we all need to dance to the same music to kind of be moving forward in time, which is a wonderful image to play with. So I think that's really powerful. It's a very helpful framing for this first panel. We've got you in terms of speaking in terms of that kind of government leadership process. We then have a representative of one of maybe perhaps the biggest and most influential kind of industry group working to kind of really make this change happen, and a democratically elected parliamentarian. So we've got some dance partners on stage. So that's good. Faustine, maybe if I can hand over to you and see what steps you would be recommending. dance steps or practical steps, however you want to take it.
I really love the image of the tango. It's one that we've played with in the past and that we actually abandoned because it's even more complex than a tango. Because we've seen at least 5 or 6 different players that need to dance together, which makes it a very tricky dance. And when I say 5 or 6 players, it's obviously the energy-intensive industries themselves, the steel players, the cement manufacturers, etc. But we also need the energy suppliers and the technology suppliers to dance with those industry players in a new way. Those players also need, obviously, to interact with their buyers across the value chain, all the way to consumers, but there are many buyers in between those material producers and the end consumers. And obviously, we also need financial institutions to play within that dance and to help those groups of industry players to invest in the right technologies at scale. Because I think we're now at a stage of the industry transition where innovation, as you say, is kind of behind us. We know we have the technologies that we need in our portfolio of solutions to decarbonize all of the sectors that are energy intensive today, be that in heavy industry or in heavy duty mobility. What we don't have is yet the plan to go to scale. And to go to scale fast, because we have 10 years to reduce those emissions drastically, and we only have 30 to get to net zero across the world, including in regions that are fast growing and where the capacity of heavy industry will need to grow and not be reduced over the next 30 years. So it's quite a complex dance we have in front of us, and it's one that the Mission Possible partnership is trying to orchestrate as an organization that brings together all of those parties, especially in the corporate sector. So we really bring all of those that I've just mentioned, energy suppliers, technology providers, energy-intensive industries, financial institutions, and big buyers, consumer good companies, to work together on how they can make progress by themselves. And it's important, I think, for them to make progress by themselves as well, because it provides confidence to policymakers that this is feasible. But then we need policymakers to enter the dance. And so I think that dialogue that you're calling for, Diederik, is really important because we are in uncharted territory. We need to design new forms of policies and to make sure that they are developed in the smartest way, that they really support industry, that they will really nudge and challenge the industry as well to go faster than they currently consider. We need to co-design those policies together. And that's really the dance and the dialogue that we hope to contribute to. I wanted to come back to the particular place of Europe in that context, because our coalitions are global. We work with about 300 companies at this stage from across the world, but the biggest share of those companies are currently European. And that's a direct influence of the Green New Deal. There is a pressure on industry players in Europe, which means that they're much more keen to go dive into the details at this point in time than their US counterparts or Indian counterparts. And we're getting there in other regions, but we can sense that Europe is several steps ahead than other regions in that context. The other thing that I think is quite interesting is that in Europe, with colleagues from the European Commission, with colleagues from the European Parliament, we're really starting to deep dive into exact policy design, very precise dimensions of how do you set up a carbon border adjustment, how do you set up a blending mandate in the aviation industry, etc. And that sets an example for other regions as well on what type of policy mechanisms could be put in place. So for instance, if I take aviation, we've done a lot of work over the past 2 years with the European Commission on what a blending mandate could look like in aviation. And tomorrow we'll be launching with a group of governments outside of Europe a policy toolkit that is extremely inspired from all of the discussions that we've had in Europe. So in that sense, Europe is also leading the way and showing what other regions can follow through with in the years to come. Across all of the industries that we've been working on, we've really identified 5 major categories of policies that need to be brought forward. I think demand creation is an important one, be that in the form of blending mandates in the transport sectors or product standards for materials in particular. But we also need to create the market infrastructure to distinguish between the good and the bad, to distinguish between the high carbon products, the lower carbon products, and the truly breakthrough zero carbon products. So there's a labeling infrastructure infrastructure that also needs to be in place. The trickiest question I think we have to address is the one of the level playing field, and in particular carbon pricing and how to manage that for industries that are internationally competitive. And that's obviously a dimension on which I'd love to hear the European Commission as well on how they see that progressing. And then there are things that are really manageable, I think, from a domestic perspective. The support to first wave, to the first movers is extremely important to de-risk investment in those first mover projects, but also the energy infrastructure. And I think we can't undermine this very important point that most of the investment required to transition the heavy industry sectors is actually investment required in the energy infrastructure. It's investment required in the power sector, in the hydrogen sector, because those very energy intensive companies will need to turn to other things than fossil fuels, and most of that will be directly or indirectly electricity. And so the biggest investment we need is actually in the power sector, not in steel, not in cement, not in sustainable aviation fuels, and that's something that we can't lose sight of. And I will just finish saying that in that context, it's encouraging to see that there are areas we can progress on domestically in Europe, and the European Commission has shown that. But we know there are areas, including the level playing field question, that will require discussions across different regions, including with the Chinese. And that, for me, is the biggest challenge we have in front of us, because I'm quite confident that we can get there within the region on the things we can manage by ourselves.
Excellent. Thank you, Faustine. And I should say, so after we've heard from all our panelists, I will take 2 or 3 questions from the room. So be prepared, because I'm going to take 1 round of questions. So if you don't get it, don't sit and think I'll get another chance. I thought that was really helpful, and I think, you know, so much richness there. But what I'm going to particularly take away from it is that you've taken Diederik's metaphor of the tango, and in my mind, kind of made it even more kind of sophisticated. And given, I'm going to channel our location here in Scotland. Anybody who's been to a Scottish wedding will be able to imagine. So I think maybe rather than a tango, we're in a ceilidh. And we're all, the challenge with this ceilidh is there's whereas there were 3 partners in the tango, there is everybody is a caller in this ceilidh of moving forward. We've all got to dance in time, and we've all got to find that time together. But if I leave you with that one just to ponder on, and I hand over to Jakob from the European Parliament for a parliamentary perspective.
Thank you so much. I'm going to continue on the tango metaphor and share some insights on the legislative process, and that it can differ quite a bit dancing with the business representatives depending on which part of the business they represent. So 5 years ago in 2016, I was in charge of the Greens in European Parliament of negotiating the reform of the ETS, specifically then on industrial and energy emissions. So I was meeting with various representatives and stakeholders. So one day, I think in June or May in 2016, I had a meeting with some representatives of the Swedish steel industry. And they told me that it doesn't matter if you increase ambition of our, it won't affect our emissions. Since if you increase ambition, that will just make sure that we will lose competitiveness towards manufacturers outside of Europe. So it will not decrease emissions at all. And they told me that we have no ways of innovation, so that price signal won't stimulate innovation on our behalf. And I asked them, well, are you sure? Is there no way of having innovation for steel production? And they said, no. Well, there's just one way. We could use hydrogen, but that's extremely expensive. It's very difficult. It's a pie in the sky idea. We won't be able to do it. And then the meeting ended, and I was very depressed. I go back to my office and I ask my assistant, well, what's the next meeting? And they told me, well, you're meeting an Irish cement company. And I thought, great, another meeting with the business representative telling me that I'm destroying industry in Europe as we know it. And I go back to the meeting room and I meet this guy, Donald O'Ryan, from this Irish cement company. And to my surprise, his message was quite the opposite. He told me that if you increase ambition, if you increase the linear reduction factor, if you decrease the free allowances, that will actually create innovation for me, because my company, Ecosem, has a new way of producing cement that has drastically lower emissions, so we can profit by this higher ambition. But the problem is our technology is new, while the old industry they had made their investments a long time ago, so their margins are much easier, and we have to cover our R&D costs, therefore we have to have a higher price. So we are not yet competitive, but if you increase ambition, we will become competitive. What later happened in that legislative process is that the industrial representatives in Europe formed up as a wall. Regardless of which companies within the industries and regardless of industry, they all lined up together and lobbied cohesively towards us as legislators and saying, don't increase ambition, don't increase the linear reduction factor, don't decrease free allowances, because they jointly listened to the ones who would benefit from status quo, and they did not listen to those who would benefit from change. What then later happened is that in Sweden, my party, the Greens, are in government in Sweden, and we introduced a climate law, which required all economic activity in Sweden to be carbon neutral by 2045, and we required all major businesses to come up with pathways to get there. And then a light bulb turned on in the leadership of the Swedish steel industry. They realized if they want to stay in Sweden for the coming decades, they need to change their act. And we also introduced quite substantive support systems. And then they took the decision to take this pie-in-the-sky idea and thought, well, maybe we can do something with this. And they formed a partnership with some parts of the industry, and then they went for it. And what's happening now, 5 years later, that the same steel industrial companies are now paying for lobbyists still, but they're not sending them to me to ask for lowering ambition. They're sending them to my colleagues, asking them for higher ambition. Because now the very same steel company is now benefiting from higher ambition. So my message to the business industry is stop listening to those parts of the industry that benefits from status quo. And this is especially important for the likes of Business Europe and those kinds of big conglomerates whose management is usually listening more to the conservative parts of the industry. And if we want true change to happen, we as politicians need to be able to point to those businesses who can flourish in high carbon price environment, because otherwise we as Greens or other progressives will never get the mandate for that change if the citizens only hear from the losers of ambition and never hear from the winners. And that's why you guys are so important. Thank you.
Thank you, Jakob. That's really helpful. And as director of CLG Europe, which is in some senses a kind of like counter or competitor, different voice to Business Europe, I couldn't possibly comment about your messages there. So I wanted to see if anybody in the audience had any questions. I'm already aware that Faustina's already put a question to Diederik, and I have some that I can put to the panel. But perhaps you could come and just use this microphone to ask the question so that we can make sure that people get it on the live stream.
Hi, I'm Albert Chung from Bloomberg NEF. I'm just curious, all of your views on how much does the end user really have to know about this or understand it? You touched on it a little bit, but the buyer of an automobile or the buyer of a house that's been built from green concrete, do we need them to understand and care and pay for this, or does it not really matter and we can do it in the background?
Thank you. And does anybody else have a question? Yes, to a gentleman at the back, and if you would mind coming forward.
So Tom Dowdall, Science-Based Targets. Question is for Diederik as an ex-campaigner. One line, how can you make what's happening in Sweden happen in other countries across Europe where you reward the winners and basically incentivize that change rather than listen to the people of the past?
Great, thank you. So maybe if I could put all of those questions to the panel. So how do we think about end users? How do we think about level playing field? How do we make the rest of Europe like Sweden? And I'm going to add a rider to this, which is, is there a balance between, so Diederik, your opening remarks, you talked about a disruption, you talked about the transformation. How do we make regulation that supports disruption? So there's a lot there. We
and-
just go
and-
down the panel with each of those.
And the funny part of it, on talking about disruption, we both took the same example. And that's a little worrying. Aren't there more examples? Well, luckily there are. But steel is a very prominent one. I'm not sure whether our ambition should be to make the rest of Europe like Sweden. But we learned some lessons. Because, for instance, also Europe designed its climate law based on a few inspirational examples, one of them being Sweden, the other ones being some other countries that did the same. So Europe is already sort of converging towards that thing. And by doing so, I wouldn't say we ignore the signals of the losers, because sometimes you need to pick them up to improve your policy or to help them get along. In the end, this is about a transition that needs to be just. It needs to be a just transition, otherwise there will just not be a transition. And that is not only for poor households, that we always have in mind talking about this, energy poverty and the likes. No, it's also about companies that just forgot to make the right step or didn't have the opportunity or the investment capital. So I do see your point of being inspired by the winners, but I would like to add that we need to listen to the losers in order to be able to help them get along. So that would be my answer on do we need to look like Sweden. By the way, I do know Sweden does this. So if there's one country with quite some equality, then it's Sweden, obviously, itself. On the end users, it's quite let's say a pragmatic vision. Don't bother them. Just make the right products, put them out on the shelves in the supermarket or wherever, or in the house market, and let them buy it. I don't think we will completely get there. I'm sometimes inclined to follow that idea because, oh my God, it's so complicated to involve the consumer into this conversation. There's a bloody 500 million of them, so in Europe. So, but I tend to resist that temptation to leave them out of the equation and just don't bother them, because I do think, as I said, in the 3-person tango or the even more complicated Scottish wedding dance, they are part of it, a pretty important one, not only as a consumer, but also, as I said earlier, as a voter, as a part of society. So no, we need to incorporate them, and yes, also maybe paternalizingly teach them about sustainability and about the merits of choosing a better product, even when you have to pay a little more for that, because it will drive the change forward. And on the level playing field, there's a lot of discussion possible. Obviously, we have a level playing field right now using free allowances for industry that are under international competition. We have a level playing field on the lowest possible level. That's 0. So we give the free allowances to our European industry to level up, or level down actually, with the rest of the world. The carbon border adjustment mechanism will create another level playing field on a much higher level. Because instead of handing free allowances to our industry, we require the rest of the world to level up with where we are. If you want to come into Europe with your roll of steel, fine. But at the border, you have to pay the amount for the carbon intensity that the product has, that the European competitor pay too. And if you paid at home, fine, you don't have to pay anymore at the border. So I think it's a perfectly equivalent level playing field, but on a higher level. And that's where the environment benefits. And on top of that, because I know there's also discussion, no, the level playing field is not complete because, for instance, our exporting industry will have some trouble if we take away all the free allowances. I know. But my reply to that would be, obviously, we have to calibrate that carefully. But we also have to keep in mind that Europe has always been in front of the pack, which is by definition sort of challenging your level playing field. We were the ones first abolishing child labor. And I can tell you, abolishing child labor is getting rid of the cheapest form of labor. So here we are, because we all thought that it was better for kids to go to school than to make products at the cheapest possible way. So at that point, industry, which is more than 100 years ago, luckily, but industry started to complain about a level playing field. And it did again when we introduced the first labor rights for adult laborers, social rights. Again, complaints about level playing field because the rest of the world didn't. And then we had all those environmental obligations about pollution and things. And again, a discussion about level playing field. We always had that discussion, and I like to have it, but also, and I like to be challenged as a legislator on breaking the level playing field, but I also like to challenge industry, because being subject to a non-level playing field is like having to perform at your best possible level, top sports, and it makes you better. And here we are, after 100 years of not having a level playing field with the rest of the world, industry in Europe is thriving. And it's the best industry that we have on planet Earth in terms of its benefits for society as a whole. So if we calibrate it right, we shouldn't be too afraid of a bit of a non-level playing field.
Faustine, over to you.
I'll be very brief. I'm conscious we're running out of time. I just wanted a quick comment on the question of customers. I tend to agree. I think customers will not be able to perceive all of the variations in low carbon different low carbon dimensions of end products. I think there are two good news in that context. One is that even a greener product, when you run the cost to end consumer, the increase in cost will be 1%, 2% maybe, but not much more, because there are so many variables in the cost of your final products that the increase in price of steel or cement won't have a major impact on consumer prices. So that makes it much easier to sell those greener products to consumers today. The other key dimension is that there are, as I said earlier, buyers in between the steel manufacturer and the end consumer. And those buyers are under a lot of pressure from financial institutions in particular and governments to reduce their Scope 3 emissions. And heavy industry, heavy duty transport are the Scope 3 emissions of other players in this space. And I think that's going to also drive demand for greener materials and logistics services.
Thank you, Faustine. Jakob.
I'm going to continue on what Faustine said about it matters where the price signal is in the entire process. As we talked now about Swedish steel industry, their new process is of course incredibly expensive. However, they already have buyers from Volvo. But the question is, why does Volvo make these purchasing decisions? Why do they buy it even though that steel will be more expensive? Well, because of the actual steel cost is so small part of the final product, and the PR benefit is worth much more than the price increase of the steel. However, we cannot only rely for the green transition to be dependent on PR benefits. We also need to make sure that this signal goes to all consumers, regardless if you care about climate benefit or not. That's why we need, for example, green steel quotas, requiring purchasers of steel to buy a certain amount of carbon-free steel that would increase demand. And same thing we need for cement. We need a quota or carbon contract for difference. I'm open to various methods of doing this, but we need, on top of the normal price mechanisms for everybody that will support incremental change, we also need other measures to truly support those breakthrough inventions that won't be profitable even with the incremental increases of the linear reduction factor of the ETS.
Thank you so much, all three of you. So I'm going to take this opportunity. We're going to change chairs and microphones, so our speakers, rather, are going to change it. Thank you. I think that's been fascinating. A round of applause for our great speakers. So we've established this, and so CLG Europe is a group of leading businesses, so we wanted to kind of carry on this conversation, particularly with some businesses involved in this sector. So I'm very pleased to introduce Harry Verhaar. So if you could take the first chair, Harry, and then Anthony, and then Emmanuel. So Harry Verhaar, who is the head of global public affairs at Signify, the lighting company, but also we're very pleased that he's chair of CLG Europe, and so provides a lot of leadership and indeed is a great advocate of sustainability and the kind of changes we need to see. We also have Anthony Abbots, who's director of group public affairs and sustainability at Rockwool Group, and Emmanuel Normand, vice president for sustainable development at Saint-Gobain. So companies involved, particularly in the building sector, but very interested in this topic around demand for climate neutral materials and demand for circular materials. So maybe if I could start with you, Harry, to talk a little bit about this topic and also about some of the work that we're doing in this space.
Thank you, Elliot, and thank you all for being here. Actually interesting also listening to the previous panel. So we're all in the same profession, influencing choice, be it voting behavior or be it buying behavior, based on benefits throughout lifetime. Just a few words on the task force. The task force was launched in September with the aim for the corporate leadership group to look like multi-sectoral and across the value chain. How can we drive change towards carbon neutral materials and products? And actually also then in December, mid-December, during the European Sustainable Product Week, I think it is, then the report will be launched with more detail. Also what we learned throughout the coming weeks and so forth. So a little bit on let's say, on carbon neutral products and materials from our perspective. So we look at 3 angles. So there are 3 areas where we see then it's relevant to address carbon and to go to zero. So we've reduced our corporate footprint, so our operations to zero, to neutrality last September. Then we also look downstream to our customers, Scope 3. So maybe just a quick word on that. So since 2006, when lighting was 19% of global electricity, so almost 1/5, is now down to 12%. But then also almost with the same time frame as the task force, we're looking at embedded carbon, which also, as you source components, as you source sometimes products and services, and then this needs to go to zero. It's not completely in your hands. In a way, somebody's Scope 1 and 2 is somebody else's Scope 3, and the other way around. And it's really important for part to look at, let's say, carbon-intensive materials, like steel and cement, but also when you look at it from a product perspective, then products like, in our case, lighting, they consist of many materials, of many components, and also there we see an increase in demand, logically, for environmental product declarations, for looking at life cycle perspective. So is it what you are bringing to the market? Is it better? Is it lower? Is it one day also zero carbon? And that's where we see a relevance also of data. So how do you actually generate for products that are multi-component and multi-material? How do you generate the data that you feed into your enterprise data system so that it can also be included in offers to your customers? And also there's one, I think, an opportunity to have, but also one maybe risk, or let's say one challenge, if you wish. And that is that we see in the past where life cycle analysis, including carbon, were like mini PhD studies and took months, and that we also need to look at how can we do this digital, how can we develop policies that make this easy, how can you take a portfolio perspective? Because imagine you have an LED light bulb and somebody makes an analysis of the carbon content and it takes 3 months and it costs you 10,000 euro. Then by the time the declaration is available, the portfolio has already changed, had to be more innovative, etc., etc. So we need some smarter methods there, also to prevent that the initiative towards carbon neutral materials and products then will have like a huge consultancy income generation component to it. So there's one element there, maybe last remark also given time, that I would like to say is then one way also to drive, in this case, buying behavior is to include carbon in procurement. Already we see that many procurement processes are triggered at lowest initial cost. So we are making an effort across industries, and Anthony and Emmanuel can also comment on that, to look at life cycle perspective, the return on investment, total cost of ownership. But that should also include carbon. So if then carbon comes up, like hey, you got 3 choices for your street lighting or for your building, and this is like the economic comparison, and this is the carbon comparison. That will also help drive from that part of the value chain, let's say accelerate the race to net zero materials and products. So I'd like to leave with that. And
thank you so much, Harry. And I think that value in terms of the collaboration that we've been able to put together and how that affects and needs to kind of translate through the value chain for businesses is such a key point. Anthony, over to you for a Rockwool perspective.
Thanks, Elliot, and thanks, Harry. You touched on a few things that I would also like to touch on. So, not surprisingly, I'm representing Rockwool Group, company, Danish company, largest stone wool manufacturer in the world. 75% of our products are insulation products, and that's why we're playing an important role in driving reductions in carbon emissions, because 36% of EU buildings are responsible for the global carbon emissions. So there's a lot to do from a product perspective, but of course we need to walk the talk. We've, as a company, have made a commitment to science-based targets, and are driving that agenda very seriously. We have 3 key levers in order to move towards products that are close to net zero or are net zero and are circular products. There's 3 key levers, and those 3 key levers are very dependent on conducive conditions also from a regulatory perspective. It was therefore very interesting to hear the insights from the panel before. Those 3 key levers: energy efficiency, circularity, and technology innovation. If we look at energy efficiency, 42% of the carbon emission reductions that we need to achieve to get to carbon neutrality in 2050, they need to come from energy efficiency, and there's still a lot of potential, not only in buildings but in industry, to drive that agenda. We've been doing that and pushing that for many years, but we're still pushing that. The second one, technology innovation, again, we talked a little bit about it in the previous panel about the fact that the power sector is key here. We're very active in transforming some of our factories to electrical melters in order that we can do that elsewhere in other geographies. We're of course dependent on low carbon electricity, and we're dependent on the infrastructure that is available in those geographies. Sometimes we can look at some of our geographies where we can say there's less emissions from producing our stuff from coal than it is from electricity. So we have to move faster. We have to move faster. And then when it comes to circularity, there's a clear connection between more circular production processes, recycling, and lower carbon products. There are certain conditions out there in the market that are not conducive to driving circularity. For example, we have still some geographies in the EU where landfill prices are quite low. And therefore, there's no incentive to use, for example, take-back systems that we're offering in an increasing number of geographies. There's no incentives to use those. It's much cheaper just to send it to landfill. And then we have a problem because for some products, there's end-of-life emissions. So those products are going to end up, for example, in an incineration plant, and it's going to lead to end-of-life emissions, and at the end of the day, that's going to generate CO2, right? So it's important to look at all those 3 areas and look at the conditions that are currently in place. Just picking up, Harry, on your last point there, or one of your points relating to data, there was also a conversation in the first panel around data. Data is critical. If we don't have robust data, if we don't have standardized, harmonized methodologies for calculating embodied carbon, then we don't have a level playing field. And I would say, from that perspective, it's really important that we do have a level playing field, because otherwise we're risking that decisions are made that are suboptimal. So we're choosing products that we think are less carbon intensive, but actually are not less carbon intensive. So methodologies, data, that is really important.
Thank you, Anthony. I think that it feels like this is a really key theme of this COP, is that we're seeing new claims, new commitments. The ability to look at the data is critical. And I think just generally, we have to say that, in this dance, this tango, for business to be able to play its role, it needs government to be able to kind of put that standard in place so we can get that kind of standardization and benchmarking. Emmanuel, over to you.
No, thanks. And I want to elaborate exactly on that point. Saint-Gobain, we are mainly serving the building and construction market with solutions for sustainability and performance for all our customers. When we're talking about data, it's simply starting from the point that if you want to decarbonize your home, you need to know what is the carbon footprint of your home. I don't know what is the carbon footprint of my home, so I don't even know what I have to do to decarbonize my own home, even though I'm in that field. And that's really the starting point. So how you are able to generate data, so how are you able to, at the level of the materials, elaborate the right information through life cycle analysis. Saint-Gobain, we have already around 1,500 environmental product declaration covering around half of our industrial product lines worldwide. And we're continuing with the target to have 100% of our product lines being covered by environmental product declaration by 2030. And that's the starting point. But then this data needs to be usable for the end user, for him to be able to take the wise decision. It's how you are able to translate that data in information that is usable, how you're able to pass through that information across a value chain, which is a very complex and fragmented value chain. And here we see an increasing role of digitalization as an enabler of the data flow, and how you make sure that the information is reliable and you bring confidence to the choices that are being made by all the stakeholders across the value chain. And here, it's standardization and the role of regulators that are able to support that confidence. And I think that's the very important driver that can lead to accelerating the choices that we can make as an industry. I don't believe that it's a choice that the consumer is making between a product A and a product B. A product A which is cheap and high carbon intensive, and a product B which is expensive and low carbon intensive. Actually, it's very gradual. And the decision taking is very complex. It's not just based on price and carbon footprint. It's involving a number of other issues. So what we need to bring is a change of perspective. And that change of perspective through reliable, easy to use information that can be used in regulatory tools, public procurement, decisions of all the stakeholders, and driving an acceleration of the changes in the industry in order to be able to enlarge the product offer following those characteristics.
Thank you so much, all of you. I think we have time for one or maybe two very quick questions and very quick answers. Do I have any particular questions from the audience? Is there anybody who wanted to raise anything? I was just going to say, so, I mean, we've talked a lot about the role of different levers to deliver change. We heard from Diederik Samson the importance of the Fit 55 package. I think we maybe one new policy that we've heard less about is the European Union Sustainable Product Policy Initiative. And it would be interesting to hear the panel's thoughts on whether that's a kind of key opportunity. And also, you know, how do we, what their thoughts are in terms of, you know, if we get that standardization, if we get that accounting system that works down the life cycle, what are some of the key qualities that we might be looking for from that? So maybe I could just kind of give you all three of you those questions to kind of respond to, and maybe we'll just work down the panel and then we'll close. So, Harry.
Yeah, maybe just one element of it, because we can't elaborate in full, but then really, like I mentioned, so including carbon in procurement, also including the cost of carbon in the whole life cycle perspective and decision making. I remember then 2 years ago I went to the WEF in Davos and I was interviewed on beforehand by the Dutch news. And then was also, the question was, yeah, carbon pricing, what do you think about that? I said, well, we pay for sewage rights, we pay for the green and the grey containers, so we should also pay for what goes up into the air. So yeah, include those, and that the complexity is then in the execution. And that's where digitalization and data come in to create transparency and preventing that the cost will be so high that there will be others evading, also from outside of Europe, who will be evading the approach.
Thank you, Harry. Anthony.
Yeah, so what's really important is that the different policies, they fit into each other like a glove, right? We don't want situations where we have conflicting directions to these policies. And that's one of the big challenges with the EU Green Deal, is that the package is so enormous and there's so many different regulations coming out, making sure that one regulation is supporting another. We see that within carbon. We see that also within circularity, that there are great opportunities to drive a progressive agenda within those areas, but there are also risks in that we can end up in going in the wrong direction. I mean, one example is within circularity. We can have a situation where post-consumer waste is something that we're promoting, but where pre-consumer waste is not something we're promoting from a regulatory perspective. But if, from an industrial symbiosis perspective, that the use of pre-consumer waste, so waste that is coming from other industries that using as feedstock in your own industry, if that is resulting in a less carbon-intensive production, then why should you not also promote that? The same goes with post-consumer. And then the conversation around recycled content and recyclability, we're seeing that increasingly within plastic packaging, that there is a focus on increasing recycled content. What's important at the same time is that you don't increase recycled content to a level which means that you can't recycle afterwards. So there are certain balances and thresholds that you need to take into account, and that's why it's always important to look from a life cycle perspective, a holistic perspective, because pushing in one direction with one parameter can mean that you're sub-optimizing with another parameter.
Emmanuel.
Yeah, one challenge I want to elaborate on is how to reconcile complexity and simplicity. Complexity on the evaluation, the policy tools, the fact that carbon assessments need to be made on robust science, and not just on the feeling that this type of solution, yes, it's better because it looks better. But simplicity, because you don't expect all your customers to be carbon experts. So, I mean, for me, I see towards that thematic as being a major challenge, how to reconcile both complexity and simplicity in decision.
Absolutely. So we have complex markets to shift. We have a hugely complex dance to choreograph, but we need to give people simple instructions so that they know what steps to take next. On that note, thank you to my second panel, and a series of great interventions, great conversations, and I really appreciate your time and energy and insights. And thank you to the audience, and thank you for everyone who's been able to join us online today. It's been a great session, and we look forward to hearing and seeing from you more in the future. Thank you very much.